Thomas always had the grandest dreams. While sitting on the wooden steps of his family's porch, he often pictured himself as a successful man standing in front of crowds, giving speeches, signing autographs, and being admired by the world. His imagination had no limits. One day he was a world traveler, the next a famous inventor, the next a businessman with golden towers under his name. But there was always one little problem. Thomas preferred lying down and thinking about these dreams rather than taking even the smallest step toward them. The sun could rise and set, yet he remained sprawled out, lost in visions of glory. His friend David noticed this habit more than anyone else. David often passed by, carrying sacks of grain or working on errands for his father. He would laugh and shake his head at Thomas, who barely lifted a finger. "You talk about building bridges across rivers, yet you won't even cross the street to buy your own bread," David teased one afternoon. Thomas only smiled, waving a lazy hand in the air, as though the details of effort were beneath a man of his destined greatness. Despite his laziness, Thomas spoke with such confidence that sometimes people believed him, at least for a moment. He would sit by the fire at night, telling stories of the companies he would build, the books he would write, and the discoveries he would make. His words carried charm, and even James, the older mentor figure in town, listened carefully at times. But James also carried a sharp eye for truth. "Dreams are only seeds, Thomas," James said once. "They grow only if watered by work." Thomas nodded respectfully, yet his feet remained still. Perry, however, saw right through the act. Known for his discipline and energy, Perry was already managing a small shop in the market at a young age. Whenever Thomas boasted about his ambitions, Perry would cross his arms and smirk. "Talk won't fill your pocket," he said. "Actions do." Their rivalry wasn't hostile, but it was sharp enough to sting Thomas's pride. Deep down, he admired Perry's results but felt too comfortable in his lazy routines to follow his example. The gap between what Thomas imagined and what Perry achieved grew wider each day. Still, Thomas believed that his moment would come, as if destiny itself would reward his big dreams without requiring effort. Each night he promised himself that tomorrow would be different, that he would wake up early, take action, and finally begin his path toward greatness. But when morning came, he lingered in bed, stretching out the hours with excuses. The dreamer in him was strong, but the doer in him slept on. And so, Thomas's legend lived only in his mind, waiting for a spark that had not yet arrived. The next morning, Thomas woke up with the sun shining across his face. He stretched, yawned, and thought, "Today is the day I finally prove myself." But instead of jumping up, he lingered in bed, inventing new reasons to delay. "The ground is still damp from last night's rain," he muttered to himself. "Better to wait until it dries before I go out." Hours passed, and when David knocked on his door, Thomas was still lying there, staring at the ceiling as if the universe owed him a breakthrough. David sighed. "Thomas, you've been saying the same thing for months. Dreams don't carry themselves." Thomas, unfazed, grinned lazily. "Great men are patient, my friend. Timing is everything." That afternoon, Thomas strolled through the marketplace, his mind filled with schemes that required little effort. He imagined himself making easy money by buying a few rare items and reselling them, without realizing the actual labor Perry put into his successful shop. Spotting Perry stacking sacks of flour, sweat dripping from his brow, Thomas called out, "One day, Perry, I'll own shops 10 times bigger than yours." Perry smirked but didn't pause in his work. "Start with 1 sack first," he replied. The words pierced Thomas's pride, but instead of picking up a sack, Thomas walked away, mumbling excuses under his breath. James, who had been observing from a distance, shook his head gently. He invited Thomas to sit with him by a shaded bench. "You remind me of a young man I once knew," James began. "He spoke of greatness but never moved his feet. Do you know what happened to him?" Thomas leaned in with curiosity, expecting a tale of sudden luck. James's voice grew firm. "Nothing. He stayed the same. His dreams rotted away because he thought wishing was enough." For a moment, Thomas felt the weight of the words. But like mist fading in sunlight, his conviction slipped away as he laughed it off. "My story will be different," he said confidently. That evening, David tried once more to spark a change. He challenged Thomas to join him in a small project, repairing the fence near the river. "It's simple work," David insisted. "But it'll show you the value of moving your hands, not just your lips." Thomas hesitated but finally agreed. Yet when morning came, Thomas overslept, arriving hours late. By the time he showed up, David was nearly done. Thomas clapped his hands and declared, "See, teamwork makes the dream work." David, sweaty and tired, stared at him with disbelief. "Teamwork? You didn't lift a single nail." Still, Thomas smiled, proud of escaping the labor yet taking credit for the result. In his heart, though, Thomas sensed a shadow creeping in. His excuses, once amusing even to himself, were beginning to sound hollow. Perry's smirk lingered in his mind. James's warning echoed in his ears. And David's disappointment cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He lay awake that night, staring at the stars through his window, whispering, "I want greatness, but why is it so hard to move?" The ambition inside him burned bright, but his laziness, heavy as stone, held him down. The battle between his dreams and his habits was only beginning. One morning, Thomas wandered into town and found a crowd gathered near Perry's shop. Curious, he pushed his way to the front and discovered that Perry had just signed a deal to expand his business. A new branch would open in the next town, doubling his income and reputation. People clapped him on the back, congratulating him. Thomas stood frozen, his chest tightening. He had spoken of owning 10 shops, yet here was Perry, already living the life Thomas only bragged about. David caught sight of him and whispered, "See, Thomas? Hard work pays off." The sting of those words sank deeper than Thomas wanted to admit. Later that day, James invited Thomas for a walk along the river. The old mentor walked slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Do you feel the difference between you and Perry?" he asked. Thomas tried to laugh it off, but his voice trembled. "Maybe he was just lucky." James shook his head firmly. "Luck finds the man who rises early, not the one who waits in bed. You've got ambition, Thomas, but it's caged by laziness. That cage will suffocate your dreams if you don't break free." For the first time, Thomas felt the words strike his heart like a hammer. That night, unable to sleep, Thomas paced his small room. His mind replayed the cheers Perry received, the disappointment in David's eyes, and the stern wisdom of James. He clenched his fists and shouted softly to himself, "I'll change. Tomorrow I'll prove it." For once, the fire of determination lit up his chest. He prepared his clothes neatly, set aside tools to work with, and even planned to rise before sunrise. As he drifted to sleep, he imagined waking up to a new beginning, one where his ambition would finally take shape. But morning arrived, and with it the old habit returned. Thomas groaned, turned over in bed, and convinced himself that one more hour of sleep would not hurt. That hour became 2. By the time he rose, the sun was high, and the resolve he felt the night before had dissolved into thin air. Standing in front of the mirror, he stared at his own tired eyes and whispered, "What's wrong with me? Why can't I move?" Shame wrapped around him like a heavy blanket, pressing down harder than ever before. Just then, David barged in without knocking, his face stern. "Thomas, enough is enough. You're wasting your life." He pulled Thomas outside and pointed to Perry's shop, where workers were busy, stacking, carrying, planning, moving. The sight made Thomas's stomach twist. For the first time, he couldn't hide behind jokes or excuses. The truth stood clear before him. If he didn't change, his dreams would rot like fruit left in the sun. That day, Thomas realized something had to break, either his laziness or his ambition. And deep down, he feared which one would win. The following morning, Thomas sat on the porch before sunrise. For once, he had managed to wake early, though his body begged him to crawl back into bed. He forced himself to sit upright, repeating James's words in his head, "Dreams are only seeds. They grow only if watered by work." He clenched his fists and whispered, "Just one step today." When David passed by with a surprised look, Thomas called out, "I'm coming with you. Give me something to do." David raised an eyebrow but nodded, handing him a small bundle of tools. It wasn't glorious work, but it was a start. The task was simple, helping to repair the broken fence by the field, a job Thomas had avoided before. This time, though, he pushed himself to hold the hammer and nails, even though his arms ached quickly. Sweat rolled down his face and his hands trembled from the effort, but he refused to quit. David watched silently, hiding a smile as Thomas drove each nail with shaky precision. "It's harder than I thought," Thomas admitted between breaths. "But maybe, just maybe, this is how it begins." For the first time, his ambition felt connected to action, no matter how small. As the sun climbed higher, James appeared, leaning on his walking stick. He studied Thomas with quiet pride, saying nothing at first. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "You've taken your first step, Thomas. The first step is always the heaviest." Thomas paused, his heart swelling at the acknowledgement. For years, he had craved admiration without effort. Now, 1 hour of sweat had earned him more respect than 1,000 promises ever did. James's words weren't praise, they were confirmation that Thomas was beginning to break free of his cage. Later that day, Thomas visited Perry's shop again, but this time he didn't boast. Instead, he stood in silence, observing the rhythm of Perry's workers. He noticed the balance between effort and reward, each man focused, each movement purposeful, and each result tangible. Perry spotted him standing awkwardly and approached with curiosity. "No speeches today?" he asked. Thomas shook his head. "Not today. I'm here to watch and learn." Perry gave a small smirk, but in his eyes, there was a flicker of respect. Thomas's humility was a rare sight, and perhaps a sign that things were changing. That night, Thomas sat by the fire, his body sore but his spirit lighter. For the first time, he felt a quiet satisfaction that dreams alone had never given him. The world outside seemed clearer, sharper, as if his effort had opened his eyes to reality. Still, he knew the road ahead would not be easy. Laziness whispered in his ear, tempting him back to comfort. But ambition, now paired with a taste of progress, whispered louder. Thomas smiled faintly, whispering to himself, "Tomorrow, another step." Days turned into weeks, and Thomas continued to push himself with small steps. He wasn't transformed overnight, but something inside him had shifted. He rose earlier, joined David in errands, and spent evenings reflecting instead of boasting. Each task he completed added a stone to the bridge between his ambition and his reality. The townsfolk, once amused by his endless talk, began to notice the difference. "Thomas is changing," they whispered. Even James nodded in approval when he saw him carrying heavy bundles without complaint. For the first time, Thomas's name was spoken with respect, not sarcasm. David remained his closest supporter, though he didn't let Thomas slip into comfort. "Don't think a few nails and sacks make you a hero," he warned with a grin. "You've got to keep moving." Thomas laughed, knowing his friend was right. The laziness still lurked within him like a shadow, waiting for the chance to pull him back. But Thomas had learned a crucial lesson. He couldn't conquer it all at once, but he could outwalk it, one step at a time. Ambition no longer floated above him like a dream. It pressed against his back, pushing him forward. One afternoon, Perry approached Thomas in the market. The two young men stood side by side, watching workers unload carts. "You've been different lately," Perry admitted. "Less talk, more action." "I can respect that." Thomas met his eyes and nodded. "I'm still learning. But I'd rather be slow and steady than stuck in place." Perry gave a rare smile and offered his hand. It was the first time the rivalry between them softened into something like friendship. Thomas realized that true competition wasn't about boasting, it was about proving to yourself that you could grow. That evening, James invited Thomas for tea. The old mentor's eyes sparkled with quiet pride. "You've finally found the balance," he said. "Ambition fuels you, but effort carries you. Without both, you're either a dreamer who never moves or a worker with no vision. Together, they make a man who builds." Thomas listened carefully, etching the words into his heart. He knew he would still wrestle with laziness, but now he had the tools to fight back. Discipline, humility, and the strength of small steps. For the first time, he felt his ambition was not a burden but a gift. Under the stars that night, Thomas lay on the porch where his journey had begun. He still dreamed of great things, shops, travels, inventions, but now those dreams felt like destinations, not fantasies. He whispered softly, "One day I'll get there. And when I do, it won't be because I waited, it'll be because I walked." The night breeze carried his words into the dark, a promise both to himself and to the world. Ambition still burned in him, but now it was no longer trapped in a lazy cage. It had legs, it had breath, and it had begun its long, steady march.